She hasn't been relevant to this family for years, my uncle said to the mediator, his voice measured, the kind of calm that comes from rehearsal. My aunt nodded once beside him, hands folded over a manila envelope she had brought herself. The account designations reflect that. It was simply a matter of updating what no longer applied. I didn't move. I didn't look at them. I let the word land relevant, and I let it sit there. Then the mediator set down her pen, looked across the table, and asked my uncle's lawyer a question so quiet it almost didn't register. Counsel, has your client reviewed the original account holder's declaration on file with the financial institution? The lawyer's hands stopped moving mid-note. The room shifted, not loudly, not visibly. But my aunt's fingers pressed harder against that envelope. And for the first time since we'd sat down, my uncle turned his head toward his lawyer instead of the window. I had been waiting for that moment for 11 months. The conference room at the Financial Mediation office in Ottawa was nothing like what people imagine when they picture disputes over money. No mahogany panels, no dramatic lighting, just a rectangular table, ergonomic chairs, a whiteboard with dry erase smudges from the last session, and a window that looked out onto a parking structure. The kind of room where decisions get made because someone has to make them, not because the setting demands it. My uncle sat directly across from me. He wore a blazer over a collared shirt. No tie deliberate, I suspected. Approachable but professional. The kind of man who understood optics. He had always understood optics. It was one of the things that made him effective, and one of the things that made him dangerous in a room like this. My aunt sat beside him. She had her portfolio open, a yellow highlighter resting in the spine of it. She looked like someone who had organized a school fundraiser, prepared, pleasant, quietly in charge. My lawyer sat to my left. He had a legal pad, half a cup of coffee, and the particular stillness of someone who already knows how the afternoon is going to go. I had chosen him for exactly that quality. The mediator reviewed the summary of the dispute calmly. My grandmother had passed 14 months prior. She had lived in the same house in Canada for 31 years, had kept meticulous records, and had, according to my uncle and aunt, expressed a desire in her final years to simplify her estate, to remove names that had become, in their words, complications. Mine was one of those names. My uncle's lawyer spoke first. The account redesignations, he explained, had been completed lawfully through the financial institution's standard beneficiary update process. My grandmother had signed the forms. The changes were dated, witnessed, and filed. There was nothing procedurally irregular about any of it. He did not look at me when he spoke. He directed everything toward the mediator, which was tactically sound. You don't humanize the person you're trying to erase. My uncle leaned forward slightly, a cue, an opening. My mother was very clear in her final years, he said, his voice carrying that same rehearsed steadiness. She wanted things to go to people who were present, who showed up. He paused. My niece made choices that took her far from this family. We respected that. We're not here to relitigate old wounds. We're simply here to honor what she actually wanted. And then he said the thing he had come prepared to say. My niece's name on those original forms was a holdover. It stopped reflecting reality a long time ago. My aunt added, gently, carefully. These things happen when families evolve. No one meant any harm. I heard the air in the room adjust, not dramatically, the way pressure changes before weather arrives. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Not yet. The mediator wrote something down. She flipped to a second page in her file. She removed her reading glasses, set them on the table, and looked at my uncle's lawyer with an expression that was neither hostile nor sympathetic. Counsel, she said, has your client reviewed the original account holder's declaration on file with the financial institution? The question landed like a pebble dropped into still water. The ripples were invisible but real. We've reviewed all relevant documentation. Yes, the lawyer said. Careful now. The mediator held his gaze. I'm asking specifically about the statutory declaration filed with the beneficiary designations at the time of the original account opening. Are you familiar with that document? The lawyer's pen moved to his notepad and then stopped there without writing anything. My aunt looked at my uncle. He did not look back at her. I remained still. The mediator glanced at the file again. We'll return to that, she said. For now, I'd like both parties to take 15 minutes. When we reconvene, I'll be asking for full disclosure of all documentation related to the account history, including the original terms and any communications regarding beneficiary changes. She closed her folder. People stood, papers gathered. My uncle spoke to his lawyer in a low voice near the window. My aunt stood slightly apart, which was new. My lawyer looked at me once. "You all right?" he said quietly. "Yes," I said. He studied my face for a moment. "Good. Because they just confirmed what we suspected." I already knew that. I had known it for months. What they had called simplification was not simplification. It was revision quiet, careful, and conducted during a window when my grandmother could be guided without being protected. I had not planned to end up in that building. Not for this. And honestly, not for anything. Growing up, I had assumed the complicated parts of my family were normal. Most families have a version of it, the relative, who controls information, who positions themselves as the liaison between everyone else, who makes themselves indispensable by making themselves central. My uncle had been that person since before I was old enough to recognize the pattern. My grandmother was kind and precise, and she loved her garden, and she kept a handwritten log of every significant purchase she had ever made going back to 1987. She was not someone who made decisions carelessly. She was also not someone who easily said no to people she loved when they presented her with paperwork and a pen and a reasonable-sounding explanation. I had moved to Vancouver for work when I was 26. Not out of anger, not out of any dramatic break. I had a job offer in my field, a reasonable lease on a decent apartment in East Van, and a life that made sense to me 3,000 kilometers from where I had grown up. My grandmother and I had talked by phone every few weeks. She had visited once, the spring before she got sick, and we had walked around Stanley Park and eaten at a Portuguese place on Hastings, and she had said it suited me, Vancouver, and that she was glad I was settled. We did not have the kind of relationship that required explanation or justification. It simply was what it was, consistent, warm, and ours. After she was diagnosed, I came back when I could. 4 times in the last 18 months of her life. I stayed for a week each time. I sat with her, helped manage her medication schedule, drove her to appointments when my aunt and uncle were, as they frequently explained, busy. What I did not do was stay permanently. I had a job with responsibilities and a team that depended on me. That decision, the one where I didn't drop everything and move back, became, after my grandmother died, the evidence they used. She made herself absent, my uncle had said to the rest of the family in the weeks after the funeral. We can't be responsible for what that cost her. I found out about the account changes, the same way most people find out about things they were never supposed to know. A cousin, not close but not unkind, forwarded me a document by accident along with something else she meant to send. She apologized, then went quiet. I read the account redesignation form twice, then set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a long time looking at the window above the sink. It didn't feel like a shock. That was the thing I hadn't expected. It felt like recognition, the specific clarity of seeing something finally written down that you had already suspected but couldn't prove. The account was a registered savings vehicle my grandmother had opened in my name when I was 11. She had told me about it when I turned 18. Money she had set aside, not a fortune, but significant enough to matter. A deposit on a future, she had called it. She had kept it in place through every family adjustment, every shift, every year I spent in another city. She had never mentioned changing it. She had never suggested she wanted to, but someone had sat with her during a difficult stretch of months, with paperwork and a pen, and the account now reflected a different reality. The first person I called was not a lawyer. It was a friend who worked in financial compliance in Toronto, someone who understood how institutions process documentation and what questions to ask. We spoke for 40 minutes. She gave me 3 things: a list of what I was entitled to request, a referral to someone she trusted, and a single piece of advice. Don't do anything emotional, she said. Just get the paper trail. I requested the complete account history from the financial institution under the applicable provisions. It took 3 weeks and 2 follow-up letters. When the documents arrived, I sat at my kitchen table with a highlighter and a notebook, and I went through everything line by line the way I had been trained to review data at work methodically, without conclusion jumping, looking for pattern before meaning. What I found was not dramatic. It was precise. The redesignation had been processed during a 4-month window when my grandmother's health had declined sharply, when she had been on a medication adjustment that her physician had later documented as cognitively disorienting, and when my aunt had been listed as her primary contact at the financial institution. The witness signature on the updated form belonged to someone whose address matched a house 2 doors from my uncle's. None of that was illegal on its face. None of it was proof of anything. But taken together, it was a pattern, and patterns, when documented carefully, tell their own story. When I met my lawyer for the first time, he asked me the same question that mattered. What are you hoping to accomplish? I told him. I wanted the original designation restored, if it could be demonstrated that the change did not reflect my grandmother's actual intent. Not the money for its own sake. The record corrected. The distinction mattered to me in a way that was hard to explain to someone who hadn't spent years working in an environment where documentation was the difference between accountability and chaos. He nodded slowly. That changes the strategy, he said. How? We're not making an emotional argument, he said. We're making an evidentiary one. Good, I said, because I don't have an emotional argument. I have a paper trail. He almost smiled. In the weeks before the mediation, I kept my routine. I went to work. I reviewed files. I answered messages. I did not call my uncle or my aunt. I did not post anything, say anything at family gatherings I declined to attend, or ask anyone to take sides. Silence, I had learned, is not passivity. It is precision. It is choosing not to spend information before the moment when information matters. My uncle sent one message through a family intermediary. It suggested that this could all be handled quietly, within the family, without involving institutions. I read it, set my phone down, and continued with my afternoon. When you operate in environments where accountability is structural, you learn something that people raised in more informal cultures sometimes miss. The documentation is not the bureaucracy. The documentation is the protection. It exists because memory is selective, relationships are pressurized, and people in grief make decisions they sometimes don't fully understand. The paper is not cold. The paper is honest in a way that people under stress cannot always be. My grandmother had known that. She had kept 30 years of purchase records in a binder organized by year. She was not a woman who left things to interpretation. 3 weeks before the mediation, my lawyer called. We found something, he said. I waited. It's old. From when the account was first opened. What is it? A statutory declaration, he said. Filed with the original documentation. She wrote out her intent for the account in her own words, who it was for, why, what she wanted it to represent. I closed my eyes for a moment. Does it use specific language about changes? It addresses the conditions under which she would consider changing the designation, he said. The condition she described did not include what happened. I exhaled slowly. Will it be sufficient? On its own? Maybe not, he said. Combined with the timeline we've built? Yes. I think so. I thanked him and hung up, and I sat with the information for a long time without doing anything with it. That was something else I had learned. Not every significant moment requires a reaction. Some of them just require you to stay ready. When we reconvened, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. My uncle's lawyer spoke more carefully. My uncle himself had moved from the posture of a man managing a formality to the posture of a man recalculating. My lawyer did not argue. He asked questions methodical, respectful, each one narrowing the available answers. Who had accompanied my grandmother to the financial institution on the date of the redesignation? Who had initiated the conversation about updating the forms? Who had been listed as her primary contact in the 6 months preceding the change? Each answer came out careful and slightly too late. Each one left less room than the one before it. Then my lawyer submitted the statutory declaration. The mediator reviewed it in silence. My uncle's lawyer leaned over to read it. I watched my uncle's face without looking like I was watching it. The declaration was not dramatic. It was like everything my grandmother had ever produced, clear and practical. It named me. It described the account's purpose. It outlined, in plain language, what conditions would need to exist for her to consider changing it. It was signed, dated, and witnessed by a notary public she had used for 30 years. My aunt spoke before her lawyer could stop her. That was written years ago, she said. Her wishes changed. The mediator looked at her. Can you provide documentation of that change? A pause. She expressed it, my aunt said. To us. Verbally. I understand, the mediator said. And then she said nothing else. My lawyer rose. We're not asking the mediator to determine intent based on what anyone remembers being told, he said. We're asking for the record to reflect what the account holder documented herself, in writing with legal witness, at a time when her capacity is uncontested. The mediator nodded. She turned to my uncle. Do you have documentation of a subsequent change in intent written, witnessed, or otherwise verifiable? My uncle looked at his lawyer. His lawyer looked at the table. At this time, no, the lawyer said. The mediator wrote something on her pad. In the absence of documented evidence of a subsequent change in intent, she said, and given the existence of a prior declaration that is specific and legally witnessed, I am prepared to recommend restoration of the original beneficiary designation pending review by the institution. She looked up. I'll also note for the record that the timing of the redesignation coincides with a period of documented medical vulnerability, which the institution will be asked to consider in its own review. My uncle exhaled sharply. My aunt gathered her things with quick, tight movements. The mediator looked at me. Her expression was neutral, professional, but her eyes stayed on my face for 1 second longer than necessary. Miss Callahan, she said, the process from here will take several weeks. Your lawyer will walk you through the next steps. I understand, I said. Thank you. She closed her file. The session ended without drama, without confrontation, without raised voices. Just a room of people carrying different amounts of paperwork out into a gray Ottawa afternoon. My uncle did not speak to me on the way out. He walked ahead of his lawyer with his hands in his coat pockets, jaw set, eyes forward. My aunt pushed through the lobby door without holding it. I stood at the top of the building's front steps for a moment. The air was cold and clean, the kind of late November clarity that comes before the first real snowfall. Somewhere across the street, a delivery truck idled. A woman walked by with a stroller and a coffee. My lawyer stood beside me. That was about as clean as those things get, he said. I know. Most people are messier about it. I know that too. He looked at me with the expression of someone still calibrating. What happens for you now? I thought about it honestly. The same thing that was already happening, I said. Work. Routine. This just gets finished properly. He nodded. The weeks that followed were administrative. Certified letters, institutional review processes, timelines measured in business days. The financial institution completed its internal review and confirmed the restoration of the original designation. The documentation was updated. A record that had been quietly altered was quietly corrected. No press release, no announcement, no confrontation. Some members of the extended family heard what had happened. A few reached out carefully worded messages, the kind people send when they want to register sympathy without getting involved. I responded to most of them briefly and without drama. My uncle called once. I answered. You didn't have to do it this way, he said. I know, I said. But the other way wasn't accurate. A long pause. She did love you, he said finally. It was not an apology, but it was something. I know she did, I said. That's the whole point. 2 months after the process concluded, I set aside a portion of the restored funds and donated them to a legal aid organization in Ottawa that helps seniors navigate financial documentation when they don't have family members they can trust to do it for them. It was not a large amount. It was enough to cover a year of casework. I also set aside a smaller amount for a local literacy program my grandmother had quietly donated to for years, something I had only learned about when going through her personal records. She hadn't told anyone. She had just done it, year after year, because she believed that people who could read their own documents could protect themselves. She was right about that. I kept one thing from the entire process, not the account, not the vindication. A photocopy of her statutory declaration, the one she had written out in 1998, in her careful, slightly slanted handwriting, explaining who I was to her and what she wanted for me and why. I didn't keep it to look at. I kept it because it was hers. People sometimes ask me, when I tell them a version of this story, why I didn't pursue it more aggressively, why I didn't go after the witness, or push for a formal investigation of my uncle, or issue some kind of statement to the family about what had happened. The answer is that none of those things would have changed the record. They would have only changed how people felt about the record. And feelings, as I had learned early and often, are not documentation. My grandmother spent 30 years keeping careful track of things because she understood something that a lot of people only learn when it's too late. The truth doesn't protect itself. You have to write it down. You have to file it. You have to make sure it exists somewhere that doesn't depend on anyone's memory or goodwill or willingness to tell the story accurately. She had done that. She had written my name down and explained why it belonged there. They had worked around it because they thought paperwork was theirs to manage. What they hadn't counted on was that I had learned, in my own way and in my own time, to read it exactly the way she had taught me to. If you've ever had someone try to revise you out of a story you belonged in quietly, cleanly, in language designed to sound reasonable, I want you to know that the most powerful thing you can do is not louder than what they did. It's more accurate. You don't have to make a scene, you just have to know what was written down first. And if nothing was written down, you find the person who knew, and you ask them to say it clearly, on the record, where it cannot be adjusted later for anyone's convenience. Because records, when they're honest, don't forget, and they don't forgive revision without evidence. That's enough. It has always been enough. If this story stayed with you, I'd be glad to hear what it brought up for you in the comments. And if you know someone who's been quietly written out of something that should have included them, sometimes the most useful thing you can do is just remind them. The original still exists somewhere, you just have to find it.